Corey Shearer, an alumna from Delta Nu chapter at Temple University, to engage in a dialogue with the award-winning educational leader, best-selling author, and noted expert in the psychology of racism, Dr. Beverly Tatum. In preparation for today's conversation, the Educational Foundation provided each of our leaders in our organization with a copy of Dr. Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Before we begin, I would like to tee up the conversation a little bit. So for the past several years, DeFi has been working to create a diverse and inclusive experience for our members, where no matter your race, you can thrive and find belonging. It has really come to the forefront now through the IRIS Experience Survey that we have some work to do in our chapters and associations with broadening understanding amongst our membership. So I could read Dr. Tatum's ultra impressive bio, but we want to spend time really listening to her speak, so I'll keep it brief. Dr. Tatum's work leans heavily into the idea that leaders need to be prepared to have difficult conversations about race. She has stated in past interviews that you cannot solve a problem if you can't talk about it. If we truly want to increase inclusion in our spaces, we want to jumpstart the conversations about race first in our membership and then more broadly in our communities. We believe that Dr. Tatum has unique insights to help us engage in productive conversations that can lead to effective action for social change. We are so very excited to have this opportunity to speak with you today, Dr. Tatum. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to Corey to get us into the details, how we as DeFi women and leaders can lift up our communities through conversations on race.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vashti, for that welcome. And I'm just so excited to be here with you, Dr. Tatum. I was telling one of my friends that I was going to be doing this tonight, and they're like, wow, like, you're such an influencer. And it was so weird to me to hear someone say that. And I thought about how I even came to be here. And it was actually 2 years ago that I was gifted a copy of your book. I volunteer with another organization that provides wraparound support for Black and Latinx students working in tech. And we read that as a group together to really make sure that we understood who we are so that we could also support others as they were experiencing, figuring out who they were and their identity. And what it really came down to for me was just learning information and sharing that information. So if you're out there and you're listening, I really encourage you to take notes, take something away from this and share this with other people. That's how you're an influencer. And so really challenge you to be an influencer, whether at work, at school, in whatever spaces or rooms that you find yourself in. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight. To start, I'd really love to just ask maybe like a fun question, which is, what have you been doing to take care of yourself during quarantine?
Well, that's a great question. And let me just start by saying I'm happy to be with you all and looking forward to our conversation. I've been doing a lot of this. I've been doing a lot of Zoom conversations over the last several months. But when I just want to unwind, I have been enjoying reading, listening to music, taking a walk with a socially distanced friend. I have a walking partner. We both wear masks and keep our distance, but it's been nice to do that every day unless the weather's inclement. And that is definitely a de-stressor.
That's awesome. I think for me too, it's been really nice to go kind of back to the basics of things like walks we took for granted for while we were on lockdown seem like pleasures now. So it's so great to hear that you've been able to find little pockets of joy in your day. And I guess let's go ahead and jump in. I know we don't have a ton of time, unfortunately, with you tonight, but we're so happy that you're here. A big takeaway for me was the importance of understanding our full identities in order to create alliances. For myself, I'm Black, I'm Indigenous, I'm white. And exploring that and understanding that really was a huge part of me even being able to do the bridge building work for myself and for others that I work with. Mm-hmm. And so to open the conversation, can you share your thoughts on self-reflection as the bridge to public discourse on race?
Well, sure. Let's just start with why it's hard for people to talk about race. And yeah. I want to start there because that's part of the self-reflection, right? You know, I identify as Black, I identify as a woman, and certainly having grown up during the height of the civil rights era, you know, I was born in 1954, came of age in the late 60s, graduated from high school in 1971. And so I say that to say that when I was growing up, there was a lot of conversation about race on the news. You know, Martin Luther King was assassinated when I was 13. You know, there was a lot of conversation about race relations in the news and part of people's daily conversation because it was so present. Not that different from today, right?
Yeah.
You know, we, in the midst of the police shootings and the summer of racial reckoning, as people refer to it, there's been a lot of conversation in the media. But when we think about our interactions with ourselves and other people, just reflecting on who we are and how we came to understand the world around us is an important part of that process. And so I often like to ask people, and I would engage all of the listeners, you know, everyone who's tuned in, to take a moment and just think about this question. Think about your earliest race-related memory.
Mm.
And if you do think about that, if we were all in a room together, I would ask people to raise their hands, and I'd say, raise your hand, you know, if you thought of something. My experience is that if you ask that question, most people will raise their hands. They thought of something. I'm not going to ask you, Corey, to tell me what you've thought of, but would you raise your hand? Have you thought of something?
I'd raise both hands.
Yes. Okay. So most people will, right? Most people will. And if you were to ask how old were you at the time of the thing you remembered, for a lot of people, that might be elementary school age, 5 or 6 or 7. I see Vashti nodding her head. Yes, and you too, Corey. How old were you in your memory?
I think it was probably 4 or 5.
Yep. So for some people, I've heard I have a memory actually that goes back to being 3. So
Wow.
Preschool, kindergarten, early elementary is very common. Now, some people will say, really, not till I got to college or later in high school. There's no right answer to that question, but I pose it because for many people, it's an early memory, you know, in their early childhood. And then if I were to ask, well, what emotion is attached to that experience? People will say things like sadness, anger, fear, embarrassment, guilt sometimes, shame, confusion. Sometimes people will say, you know, love or happiness, but most of the time it's an uncomfortable feeling of the kind I just described. And then if you ask, well, okay, so you were a young kid, 5, 6, 7, maybe even 4 in your case, and you had an experience that you still remember and that made you feel some feeling of discomfort. Did you tell anybody about it at the time that you?
No.
Yep. So you didn't. Most people will say Vashti is right there with you. She's saying no too. Most people will say no. Some people will say, yeah, I talked to my mom or I talked to the teacher. Most people will say they didn't. But if you have any experience with 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds, they're pretty chatty. They tend to blurt stuff out. They don't hold stuff in. So how is it that so many adults, years later, can remember something from that time in their lives, can remember the feeling attached to it, and yet say, I didn't talk to anyone about it? What that teaches us, I think, is that we learn from a very early age not to talk about these issues, not to talk about them. And why is that important in this conversation? When you ask about what kind of self-reflection is required to build bridges, part of the self-reflection is just to acknowledge that race has been a factor in your life. You know, if you identify as a person of color, you know it has been. But even if you identify as a person who is white, part of the racial majority in your community or your school, if that's been your experience, you might say, well, you know, racism, I don't know much about it. It wasn't part of my life experience. But when I ask you to remember, you can remember something going all the way back to childhood. So that lets us know that we all have been impacted in one way or another by this social issue. And so part of self-reflection is just acknowledging that racism impacts all of us in different ways, but all of us, and that we all have some confusion about it, right? You know, maybe that confusion is, why does this still happen? Maybe that confusion is, well, what is it really? You know, is it just prejudice? Is it, you know, people talk about systemic racism. What does that mean? You know, you hear people now using the term anti-racism. What does that mean? You know, that there are lots of questions that people have that can only really be answered through dialogue. You know, talking to someone like me or reading a book, talking to others. But if we can't have the conversation, we can't engage in that self-reflection that is necessary to begin to build bridges. So that's the first thing I would say, is that we have to push past our discomfort, push past our initial hesitation or reservation about engaging in these conversations. Some people will say, you know, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to participate with others because I might say something wrong. I might say something that offends. I might say something that, you know, makes me look as though I have prejudices. And my answer to that, of course, is that you're likely to do that. You're right. You might say something wrong. We all are likely to make mistakes. But if you wait until you're perfect, if you wait for perfection, the conversation will never begin, and you won't be able to do the work that helps to shift this, to build those bridges. You won't be able to build those bridges if you wait for perfection.
And I love so many of the things you said, and I just want to highlight a couple of those things. And the first is about making mistakes. I think for me, I danced growing up, and something that my dance teacher always said was make big mistakes. If you're going to make a mistake, make it really big so we can see what's happening and we can address it. But if you make a small mistake or you're shy about it, we'll never really know, right? So I think it's so important, like you said, to just like go into this work knowing that you're going to make mistakes, but that it's okay. And that like actually empowers you and enables you to know maybe an area that, you know, you need a little support in, or you need to address a little bit. I think the other thing that I really love that you kind of reframed how we think about race. I think a lot of times we think about the race conversations as a conversation for people of color only, and I think that's absolutely wrong. It needs to be inclusive. And so I love how you even say, like, you know, white people, we need you too. We need you to understand your own identity and before you can even start to do that work. And I think that really reframes how we think about it, where it's not like us versus them. It's like it's a human issue. It's an us issue. And I really love that. And I would just encourage folks, as you're joining as well, or as you're listening, feel free to respond to the questions that Dr. Tatum is asking. If you have, you know, if you know of an experience that you had or the age that you were when you first, you know, heard about race, like let's use the chat. Let's talk about those things, and we can respond to one another as well. So on that, I want to keep the conversation going. So go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So I actually wanted to go to one of the questions that was actually submitted by one of our members. So I'm going to read this so I get it right, but they identify as someone who is white, who predominantly serves Black and Latinx students in the classroom. And, you know, they want to make sure they're not censoring themselves somehow because of her whiteness. But she also expressed a fear that her students wouldn't see her as an ally, especially in this world where she's teaching remotely and it's a little harder to show empathy across a screen, right? And so she really commented on how they might be too young to understand. But after reading your book, we know that there is no such thing as being too young to understand race, right? And we just talked about how, for even me, I was like 4 when I first came to know it. You were 3. So can you share your experience about that and kind of what that looks like for early childhood development?
Sure. So let's start with the teacher's question. So, you know, white teacher, kids of color in the classroom, that's a common scenario. We know that most teachers in the United States are indeed white, most of them women. And so there are lots of white teachers in classrooms with kids of color. We just know, you know, that's just the reality of the demographics of the teaching staff, and particularly in public schools. What I don't know from her question is how old, like what grade she's teaching. You know, maybe she's teaching kindergartners, maybe she's teaching 4th graders or 5th graders. We don't really know. But even if it was kindergartners or preschoolers, there are ways to talk about issues of race and racism with even young children. If you're working with 3-year-olds, the conversation might not be about racism per se. You might not be talking about systemic racism, but you might be talking about physical differences and helping kids understand, gee, why is Jonathan's skin brown and Tommy's skin is lighter? Why is Susie's hair curly and Jill's hair is straight? There are good reasons and explanations to be given to kids that are age appropriate, and we can appreciate differences and describe those differences in ways that are affirming of all of the kids, right? I know that the listeners, there may be some of the members on the line who are parents who might be wondering, well, how would you do that? And I'm just gonna put in a plug for a TEDx talk I gave, which is on YouTube. It's easy to find. It's called, "Is My Skin Brown Because I Drank Chocolate Milk?" That's all about, that particular TEDx talk is all about talking to preschoolers about physical difference. But even if we're not just talking about just differences that kids can see and have questions about, you can also talk to kids about unfairness. What does it mean when someone is being treated unfairly? If we hear somebody talking about racism, well, what is racism? Well, racism is a kind of unfairness, when people are being treated unfairly just because of the color of their skin or just because they belong to a particular group. And so even 3-year-olds get the concept of fair and unfair, right?
Yes.
They don't have the same kind of adult understanding that 13-year-olds have, but there are definitely ways to help kids start to think about what it means when something is unfair and what can we do to make it more fair. Like, well, how can we fix that, right? So it's not just telling them that things are unfair, but things are unfair and we want to change that so that they will be fair. And so those are examples of talking to 3-year-olds or preschoolers. But let's say you're talking to 10-year-olds or 13-year-olds. Maybe you're teaching middle school, and maybe you are the white teacher of Black and brown middle schoolers, and you want to be sure that they see you as an ally. Well, one way you can do that is to affirm their identities. How do you do that? There are ways to be sure that you've got materials in the classroom that reflect those identities. Are there books? Are there, if you're on the screen, you're talking about some curricular materials, are there visuals that you can share where kids can see themselves in the materials? I like to use this analogy. I think it's a powerful one. Many teachers tell me it helps them. And that is the idea of a group photo. Let's imagine we were all together in the same room and we took a photo together. And then and I'm sure, in the chapters, people take group photos all the time of all the members of their chapter. You take that group photo and then everybody gets a copy of the photo. And the first thing we all will do when we get our copy of that picture is to look for ourselves, right? Each person, I'm looking for, Beverly Tatum is looking for Beverly Tatum in the picture, right? And everyone is going to do that. And not only do you look for yourself in the picture, you want to find, after you've spotted yourself in that group photo, now you're going to evaluate how you look. Are my eyes open? Was I smiling? Did my scarf look good? Right? All of that. And so let's imagine that instead of seeing ourselves in the picture, we had been digitally removed. Somebody photoshopped us out of the photo. Now we get the picture, we're looking, we don't find ourselves in that picture. We're going to say, what's wrong with this picture? But if day after day after day, we're always in, we get these photos every day, every day we look and we have been removed from the picture. After a while, we don't say, what's wrong with that picture? We might say, what's wrong with me? Why am I not ever included in these photos? And the school curricula, the curriculum is kind of like that. It's like a group photo. I want to see myself in that picture. And when I don't see myself in the picture, I either think there's something wrong with the picture or there's something wrong with me, or both. And that, so the first thing the ally, the teacher who wants to be an ally is to make sure to ask the question, who's missing? And try to do something about that. And that is a good place to start. There's something else that's really important, and you'd think this was obvious, but you'd be surprised how many teachers I talk to who sometimes don't do it. Learn the kids' names and pronounce them correctly, right? You know, if you've got, if, you know, when people usually get Beverly right, it's not too many different ways to say that, but, you know, but there are names that sometimes people don't know how to pronounce because they're unfamiliar to them. I'm getting a testimonial here from Vashti up in the gallery here. And if those names are unfamiliar, sometimes what adults will do is to say, that's too hard for me. I'm going to call you something else.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's too hard for me. I'm going to shorten your name in this way. Or, you know, I'm just going to keep mispronouncing it. And every time you do that, you are saying to that person, I don't see you. Right? I don't see you for who you are. I see you for who I'd like you to be. Some other person with a different name, right? And that is undermines the relationship between you and the student. It seems like a small thing, but you'd be surprised. I mean, you would think everyone would work on that, but but they don't always. They don't necessarily always recognize that that's important. So if you are affirming identity by learning names and pronouncing them correctly, and making sure that everyone sees themselves represented in the classroom, you're off to a good start. There are, of course, other things you can do to talk about, you know, current events and help students understand what's going on and listen. You know, often that's the one thing that an ally can really do that sometimes gets overlooked, is be a really good listener to see what's on the minds of students.
And I love everything you just said. And I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning, but I actually work at Quizlet, which is an online learning platform. And as part of that, I've started volunteering in the classroom. And I volunteered in international high school where most, I think 99% of the students are immigrants. And they're so conditioned now when they introduce themselves to say, this is my name, but you can call me this, because no one can say my name, or everyone else does this. And it just breaks my heart. And I'm like, no, what do you want to be called? And I think it's just so key, like you said, in terms of allowing someone and giving someone permission to decide how they identify and how that impacts their confidence, and in so many ways inside of the classroom and outside of the classroom as well. So I think that's so huge.
Yes. Well, I hope
and I think
to your member, your teacher member.
Yeah. And it looks like we have a bunch of awesome comments as well affirming kind of what you just said. And, you know, Tamika said about even having crayons. I know that was like a huge thing that was, I think even after I graduated from high school, where Crayola even made crayons that were all different skin tones, right? So I think we still have a long, long way to go in order to really help people see themselves in school.
Yes.
And so I want to keep going. I really like where this conversation is going, but I want to talk about the psychological cost of silence, which is a topic that you cover in your book in a lot of detail. And you talk about how unchallenged racism leads to the loss of human potential and creates a rising tide of fear and violence in our society. And a few members actually asked about how do we help people be less afraid of Black people? And it feels really related, right? And so can you talk about the cost of silence and what that actually means?
Sure. Well, let's start out with, I'm going to work my way back to that question. I want to start with, you know, how to be less afraid of Black people, right? You know, I mean, so.
It's a big one, right?
in that question, what it makes me think about is the fact that we are exposed to stereotypes about people of color from a very early age, right? So it doesn't matter whether you are, it doesn't matter what your own racial or ethnic background is. You know, we all watch the same television. You know, we all have been exposed, you know, the same Saturday morning cartoons or whatever it was. You know, the sources of popular culture are no boundaries. And in that context, there are a lot of stereotypes about Black people as dangerous, right? You know, there's a lot of, you know, the criminalization of Black people, particularly men, but not only, right? But particularly men as somehow dangerous or criminal or, you know, just to be avoided and to be afraid of. Those stereotypes are part of the popular culture and have been for decades, if not centuries. And so it is not a surprise that people who have not had much interaction with Black people might have internalized some of those stereotypes. Now, if you are a Black person and grew up in a Black community and, you know, I have Black brothers and a Black husband and Black sons, and, you know, I have a network of Black people in my life. I'm not afraid of those people, right? The more social interaction you have, the more firsthand experience you have, the less vulnerable you are to stereotypes. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't also absorb some of them, right? But you are less vulnerable if you have firsthand experience. You know, if somebody says to me, oh, Black men are like this or like that, I can say, my father wasn't like that. My husband's not like that. My brothers aren't like that. My sons aren't like that. You know, there may be somebody you know who's like that, but that doesn't generalize.
Doesn't define one experience.
Yes, exactly. So this is to say, the less experience you have, the more vulnerable you are to these stereotypes. So when the person asks the question, how can we make people less afraid? Increase exposure, right?
Yeah.
You know, join organizations, become part of volunteer groups, do things that will put you in interaction. When I was teaching my psychology of racism class, and if, you know, having read my book, you know that there are a lot of examples from my teaching experience in the class. One of the assignments I used to give my students, this was when I was teaching at Mount Holyoke College, which is a women's college in Massachusetts, and predominantly white, a diverse student body, but predominantly white. And one of the assignments I gave my students was to go somewhere where they would have the experience of being in the minority. And if you're a white student at Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts, most of the places you go, you are not in the minority, you're in the majority. So students would ask me, well, where can I go to have such an experience? I don't know where I should go. For a lot of people, the place they chose to go was to a church that had a predominantly Black congregation. South Hadley, Massachusetts is not far from Holyoke, Massachusetts, which has a large Puerto Rican population, or Springfield, Massachusetts, which also has a large Black population. And so sometimes they would decide, well, I'm going to go to, you know, Alden Baptist Church on Sunday morning, and that will be my experience. But it was very surprising to me that they would be quite nervous. My students would talk about being very nervous about going because they were afraid that they would perhaps be made to feel unwelcome, or, you know, there's not, you know, unfortunately, there are some sad exceptions, but it's rare that we see acts of violence in churches, and it's usually a pretty safe place to be. And so after they would go, they would come back and tell me what a great experience they had. They always felt very welcomed. They would talk about how friendly and welcoming parishioners were and how, folks helped them and all of that. And so when they talked about their experience after the fact, it was striking for them to be able to reflect on just how nervous they were before and how their fears about what would happen did not materialize. That in fact, it turned out to be a very positive experience. So to answer the question, how do we get beyond our fear? We have to sometimes just take the leap of putting ourselves in positions where we might have experiences with folks we're not used to interacting with, and being open to that as a way of getting started.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too. And what struck me when you were speaking is that your students were afraid that they would face prejudice from the population that is facing prejudice every day. And I think that's so interesting in of itself to just like look at, because I've heard that a lot too. And I'm like, well, that's my experience every day. And I think it's, it's just so healthy. And I love that you have that in exercise, and would challenge folks who are listening to think about what that might look like for you, and maybe drop some suggestions in the chat, or if you have done that, what you've done and what that experience has looked like for you. And so I want to talk more about kind of going back to the top of our conversation. We talked about why having these types of conversations are so hard. And you talk about in your book, embracing a cross-racial dialogue, which again, I think is the only way that we're actually going to make impactful and lasting change in this area. And is why we have you here, right? Because I think this is just the beginning and not the end of these types of conversations. Can you talk more about that topic, and potentially 3 things, or just like any kind of practical tips that you have for our members, for our, larger international organization, that we can do to really help people push past this like fear, so that we can just really dive into having this dialogue, because we're just not going to be able to move forward until we do.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is that discomfort is to be expected, right? So it's very important to acknowledge that. Though, I have done a lot of workshops in my life, right? I've been teaching about racism since 1980. So this is now 2020. So that's 40 years, right? So I've been doing this for 40 years. And over the course of that time, I've had the opportunity to work with lots of different people. And I'm thinking right now of a white male teacher who was in one of my professional development courses that I taught years ago, and now does diversity training, professional development himself. Now he's sort of a train the trainer kind of thing. And one of the things he said to me was, he said, Dr. Tatum, you're always talking about how these conversations can be uncomfortable, and they can be. But he said, but I think you need to talk more about the joy that comes from them. And I think that is a good point, because joy does come from them. But you have to get past the discomfort to get to the joy, right? So when I like to sometimes say there's kind of an arc of discomfort. So, you get into these conversations, people are nervous at the beginning. There's a lot of initial discomfort. People start breaking the barrier of silence. They start speaking up. And as they're speaking up, they are maybe saying some things that rub somebody else the wrong way. Maybe there's some tension. Maybe there's even some conflict. Maybe there's some disagreement. And it doesn't feel great. Mm-hmm. But if you go home, think about what was said, think about what you said, think about the feedback you got, and then you come back again next week, the conversation will be better the next time. And you can talk about, well, I said this, and this is the feedback I got, and I thought about it, and now here's what I think. There's some dialogue happening, listening respectfully. And it might not happen the second time, or even the third time. But maybe by the 4th or 5th time, it's like, this is really getting good. We're having some great conversations. I'm starting to really understand where she's coming from. She's starting to really understand where I'm coming from. Gosh, I have so much energy. Where did this energy come from? And this kind of circles back to your earlier question about the cost of silence. One cost of silence is a lot of dammed up energy. What do I mean by that? It's like, imagine there was a big elephant in the room with you. And I told you, Corey, don't notice that elephant. You know, it would be hard, right? How could you not?
Yeah.
How could you? I mean, it's big, it's stinky, it's like, you know, might touch you with its trunk or something. You know, I mean, you would be worried about that. But if I said, no matter what, focus your attention in such a way that you just forget that elephant is in the room. And if you were able to do that, you would have used up a lot of your cognitive bandwidth to get it done, right? And then if I said, okay, time's up, you can not only talk about that elephant, I want you to get up and walk around it and look at it and inspect it and, you know, get all your curiosity out about that elephant. You would feel like, what a relief, right? Yeah. What a relief. I can finally talk about this thing that's right here in the middle of this room with me. And racism is like that. It is right here. It is stinky. It's right in the middle of this room with all of us. And yet we are trained from an early age not to ever mention it, right? Don't talk about it. Don't mention it. And because of that, we use up a lot of energy. When you give people the opportunity to really explore it, at first they're nervous. There may be moments of discomfort, but then it really gets like, wow, this is fun. You know, not, you know, maybe not like going to the beach, but fun, like, you know, I'm learning something that's really matters, and it's changing how I view the world, and I'm going to be a more whole person because of it. And that's exciting.
Yeah. No, and I love that. And I think for me too, the part that I sometimes forget about in all of this is the joy.
Yes.
Because it's just like so easy to get sucked up into how it feels like not life-giving, or how it feels like it's the complete absence or like lack of joy, right?
Yeah.
But I think something that I want to touch on, and maybe as a follow-up question, talk about the energy, which you mentioned, which I think maybe I can only speak for myself, but maybe there's some other folks that feel this way, that like, I'm all caps tired
yes.
of these conversations too. And I think as much as I sometimes want to engage, I'm also tired. And so how do you talk to people of color about maintaining and watching guard over your energy, but also knowing that these conversations are important? How do you advise people, or how would you respond to that?
I think I love your phrase, watching guard over your energy. You have to do that. Right. And so a friend of mine told me something a long time ago. I always like to share it when someone asks me a question like you do, like you just did. And that is, my friend said, the work you do is hard. If you make a lot of withdrawals, you better make a lot of deposits. You know, and so if the work you do is withdrawing energy, if you're giving energy away to do this work, and you know, how can you not? It's hard. You also have to put some energy back, right? You have if you make it's just like your bank account. If you're making withdrawals, you better be making deposits. And so in that spirit, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are times when you just have to say no. You know, there are times when you have to say, you know, not today, not this week, you know, call somebody else. I'm not able to do it right now because I'm going for a walk, right? Or I'm going to read a book, or I'm going on a silent retreat, or I'm going to do something that helps restore my energy.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, you will burn yourself out, right? And that's not helpful to anyone. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are lots of people doing this work, right? Maybe not enough, but there's more than just you, more than just me, right? So if someone asks me to do something and I say, no, I'm sorry, I can't, because, you know, I'm recharging. I might not say that's what I'm doing, but that might be why I'm saying no. because I'm going to recharge. You know, but here's somebody else you could call. You know, here's another person. We have to be willing to share the work, right? Not just, you know, the literal work, but share the load. Because it's, you know, that's what leaders do, right?
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think, you know, if you're listening now and you're a person of color and you feel like you don't have bandwidth, I'm going to say this on your behalf, Dr. Tatum, but you can tell them that Dr. Tatum said I have permission to say no. Here's a link to her book. Good luck.
Well, no, you know, I mean, I think that's what you need to do. And sometimes that's what I do on my own behalf, you know.
I love that.
In this virtual world, in this virtual Zoom world, you'd be surprised, or maybe not, but I get a lot of requests that I'm sure people think are not big requests. Like, you know, could you drop in by Zoom and greet my book club, right? You know, could you, you know, my 5th grade class is studying the civil rights movement. Could you come online? You know, and if it's my 10-year, I don't have, my kids are grown up, but let's imagine if it's my 5th graders class, yes, I'm happy to do that, you know. But if it's 1,000 people I don't know, 5th grade class, that's going to take up a lot of energy, right? It's going to take a lot of energy. And I might need to say, you know, I'm not really able to accommodate that. Yeah. But there are a lot of videos of me on YouTube. Yeah. You know, there are a lot. So let me give you a link to one that might be helpful to you. Yeah. Right? Yeah. It doesn't always have to be a yes.
Yeah. Awesome. And so I have a question for you. Sure. And some of the members who are on the call may also be curious. Are you a member of a sorority?
I am not.
Okay. So we might have to talk later about joining DeFi. But I guess kind of that aside, I would love to hear your comments on what we're seeing on Panhellenic sororities, which are at predominantly white institutions. Yeah. If you've seen any that are doing really good work in terms of creating safe spaces for their Black sisters and other members of color to survive, and if there's anything that we could be thinking about doing differently, or, you know, if there's anything where you're like, absolutely do not do this, and as you continue forward with this work.
Sure. Well, let me start out by saying that my personal experience with sororities is limited, and I'm going to tell you why. Because I spent 13 years working at Mount Holyoke College, which is a women's college, and there were no sororities at Mount Holyoke. In part because it was a women's college, there was this sense of, you know, we're all sisters here, no sororities needed, right? That was kind of the philosophical approach at Mount Holyoke. And then I left Mount Holyoke and I went to Spelman College as president, where I served there for 13 years. And so that's 26 years of women's colleges. And now at Spelman, they did have some sororities, but they were limited. Not more than 25% of the student population could be part of a sorority. And the establishment of sororities at Spelman was long in coming, in part for the same reason. We're a women's college, we're all sisters here, right? So having said that, I don't have a lot of direct experience, but with on-campus sororities. That said, I am aware that there are some, you know, of course I'm aware of the historically Black sororities, of which were represented at Spelman. And I have been on campuses as a speaker. You know, I visit a lot of campuses during the course of a year, where the Panhellenic organization, representing all the sororities, and if it was a co-ed school, fraternities as well, working to try to find ways to build bridges across what have been historically white sororities and fraternities and the historically Black ones. And of course, we know the historically Black ones were started in part because of the exclusion from the others. So that, so building bridges across, just, I mean, there's one strategy, which is the one you're asking me about. It was like, well, how do we get, how do we get a more diverse membership? And that is an important question. And, certainly I know that part of the goal, as was said at the very beginning, is to create an environment where everyone can thrive and feel like they belong, have a sense of belonging, shared sense of belonging. And at the same time, we can acknowledge that some women of color might prefer to be part of a sorority that was built with them in mind.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, are there ways to build bridges to do things together, as, Phi E and the, Delta Sigma Theta? Are there ways for those two organizations, if they coexist on the same campus, to do things together and, have cross-racial dialogue as part of a community service project? So it's not either or, I think it's kind of a both and. And so just as students will vote with their feet in terms of where they feel most comfortable, it is still, even in that context, possible to expand boundaries, through work together.
I love that so much. And I think for me, I was very lucky in that for my college experience, I actually went to a school in Philly, and we had the Divine Nine. We had multicultural Greek organizations that included Asian and Latinx sororities and fraternities, as well as IFC and Panhellenic. And for us, it was really what you said. It was really about how can we work together and not compete, knowing that each of our organizations were created for important but different reasons. And I think for us, it was really about how can we better understand what each of us does really well, right? A lot of the Divine Nine and multicultural organizations were smaller, but they were super efficient, and they had this concept of understanding that it was like for life. You were joining this organization for life and not just for 4 years. And they were really able to help us learn a lot, and we were able to also support them in the ways that we could show up. And so if you are in college and you're at a campus that doesn't have other organizations, look at local chapters nearby, or figure out how you could potentially even bring in speakers from their national organizations to have those types of conversations as well. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that topic before we move on to our last question?
Well, I am intrigued, and maybe this is a question for you, because I know you've been surveying your members and have gotten feedback. And so part of the value of that is, listening carefully feedback, because that's where you're going to get the best information. What does it mean when your members tell you, what's working, what's not working?
Yeah. And I think, Vashti, who leads our D&I committee, has done a really great job of finding us resources to not only be able to even understand what information we need to collect, but also bringing in outside support and resources to collect that information. We just went through the process of sending out a very large survey to our membership base, and it definitely highlighted some areas that we need to work on. And I think we're not shying away from this. And again, this is the start, but not the end of our conversation and the work that we're going to be doing. But I think it's become really clear to us that we're not meeting the mark in every way. But I think that just gives us so much opportunity to grow and to do more for our sisters, and for our sisters who are across lines in other organizations as well.
And that, I think, at the end of the day is what's really important, that you persist. Because, when I was talking earlier about the discomfort that comes at the beginning, what happens is, because there is discomfort at the beginning, people will say, this is too uncomfortable, let's stop. And they never get to the joy we were talking about.
Yeah.
So you have to be willing. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Looks like Dr. Tatum might have a little bit of spotty Wi-Fi. But while we wait for Dr. Tatum, looks like there's some logistical issues on her end. If you're listening and you have had really great experiences at campus with your organization in terms of things that you've done, feel free to drop them in the chat and let's share ideas for how we can start doing this work on campus. And it looks like Dr. Tatum, you're back.
Yes, I'm back. I can hear you. You can hear me?
Yeah. Sorry, I think we missed the last thing that you started to say before you froze.
Well, I'm not
You were
sure.
talking about persisting.
Yes, I was talking about the necessity to persist. So that's the value, for example, of a course like the one I taught. It was a semester-long experience. And so, maybe the first few weeks people are dealing with their discomfort, but then they get to a place where it starts to really work and the conversations deepen, and then you start to see the benefits. And as an organization, you have to push through that initial discomfort. If everybody makes a commitment to say, this is important, we're going to keep working on it. And we're not, there may be moments when it feels tough, but we're going to keep working on it knowing that it's going to get better. Yeah. I sometimes like to use the analogy of an antibiotic. If you go, let's say you have an ear infection and you go to the doctor and they give you the antibiotic and they say, your ear's going to feel better in just a couple of days, but you have to take this medicine for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And you don't like the taste of the medicine, the ear feels better, you might want to just stop. But if you do, what happens? That ear infection is coming back, and it's coming back worse, right? It's coming back worse because you've built up some resistance to it. In the same way, if we start these conversations and we don't push through till we get to the joy, the problems we were trying to address come back, and they come back worse because now people say, we tried it, didn't work, don't want to do that anymore. But they didn't really give it its full, they didn't take the full dose. You have to take the full dose.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I might borrow that analogy in the future. Great. That's a really great way of explaining that. And so I can't believe it. We're almost out of time, but I had one last question before we close, which is I wanted to just get your thoughts on everything that's happening right now with the recent movements around racial justice. I think it must be so incredible you were talking about before how you were alive during the time of the civil rights movement, and what are your thoughts on what's going on right now? Are you hopeful? Do you think we're moving in the right direction? Do you think we're actually going to make the change? I think a lot of people have said that we actually haven't made much change in the last 60 years. Will this be the time that we actually make the change? What do you think?
Well, I actually think so I'm 66 years old. So I can tell you there's been a lot of change since 1954. But after every period of social progress, there's pushback against that progress, right? Mm-hmm. So you can look at that over the course of history, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So if I tell you that, there's been progress since I was born in 1954, I can document that. I, can describe it to you, but I can also say there's been pushback against it. So as an example, we're in election season, right? The Voting Rights Act in 1954 was very difficult for Black people in the South to vote. They had the vote, but it was difficult.
It looks like we might be having some more technical issues. If folks also want to respond,
the fact of the matter is there's progress again.
So Dr. Tatum, I think you cut out a little bit as you started to respond.
Yes. Every
Yeah, so the weather is really bad where Dr. Tatum is right
Corey,
now.
I am
Yeah. Ooh.
still there. Hello.
Awesome. It looks like we still have, oh, there you are. Okay, perfect.
Yes. So
Third time's the charm.
yes. Well, I'm sorry we're having some technical difficulties, but I'm hoping people can hear most of what we've been talking about.
I think if we could just have you really quickly summarize the last little bit that you said, that would be great.
Sure. I was saying that after every period of social progress, there's pushback against that progress. And
Yeah.
We can see that over the last decade, maybe 2 decades, over the last 20 years, there's been pushback against the progress that was made in the earlier part of the last half of the 20th century. And that is what we're seeing today. And I think right at this moment, we as a nation are making a choice about whether we want to push back further or push ahead in terms of social progress. And I think this election will be diagnostic about that. So
I love
my
that.
hope is that we'll be pushing forward. Dr. King, in his last book, wrote a book called, his last book was titled, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? That was the subtitle.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the choice people are making today. We want chaos or do we want community? Voting for community.
Yeah. And I would even turn that back to all of our attendees. Where do you want to go from here today? How are you going to use this information that Dr. Tatum has so kindly shared with us? What are you going to do in your communities, in your relationships, in the conversations you have out and about on your errands? Like where do we go from here? And, before we end, I would love Dr. Tatum to know if there's any final thoughts or kind of nuggets that you want to leave us with today.
Vote.
Yeah, I love that. Short and sweet, but so important. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tatum, for being here with us today. I think Vashti's going to come on and speak about how you can get involved. The conversation definitely does not end here. We'll also be sure to send out some more links and resources to Dr. Tatum's books, her TED Talk, and all the other great resources that she's pulled together. So yeah, thank you so much again. And Vashti, thank you for closing us off today.
Of course, of course. Again, on behalf of DFIE, thank you so much, Dr. Tatum, for spending the time with us tonight. Your breadth of knowledge and commitment to this work, like you said, 40 years is an inspiration to us all. And as always, Corey, thank you for your leadership and continued commitment to this work. So for those of you that have enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Tatum and you're like, so this was great, but what's next? Like Corey said, we are currently in the works of having a follow-up event. I have just been told, like literally 5 minutes ago, that this is going to be on December 2nd with our amazing, amazing sister, Tamika Austin. We're going to be able to connect to continue to deepen our understanding of the concepts that were posed in Dr. Tatum's book. This space will be for us to learn and grow and support each other as sisters and friends. So you want to keep an eye on your inbox for those details because you don't want to miss it. And last but not least, I want to thank each and every one of you sisters for taking the time out this evening to do your part in investing in yourselves and each other and participating in this event. As we all know, we have a long road ahead of us, but the journey is best not taken alone. And like Dr. Tatum said, community. And so we joined the sorority to give support and to have support. And this is just another part of that pact. If you are interested in volunteering for my committee, the DE&I committee, to work with Corey and I, or any other committee level positions, you can visit dphi.org/volunteer and learn more and submit an application. And we're always looking alumna, collegiate, from all over Canada, the States, if you live internationally. The best part about the pandemic is anyone can do anything anywhere, right? So again, I just want to thank you all. Thank you so much for your time and commitment all, and I hope you will have a wonderful, wonderful Thursday. Bye.